So, it's my great pleasure to introduce Kuba Szreder, who, so it's an awful anglicised, sorry, lectures on art theory, writes about art beyond art and the political economy of artistic circulation, sometimes curates and engages in art workers' organisation. He currently lives in Warsaw. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for bringing me here, and especially that I'm going to be a bit of a disappointment, I'm afraid. I will not speak about photography. I won't even speak too much about images, and at least not in the context in which they were spoken about today. As a lot of people spoke about representation and all these classics of media studies, and I'm afraid I'm more specializing in a sociological or like kind of critique of political economy of art worlds or artistic circulation. Then there is yet another disappointment, maybe, which is related to this word post-capitalism. When we discussed this presentation with Ben, I kind of assumed, and my assumption actually did not really prove to be sensible, that by this time everybody in this room will actually be very well versed in what post-capitalism is. Are we? Mm-mm. Well, yeah. And not only that, it seems that I'm not sure like how it is with others of you, but that I do not know this word post-capitalism, or this notion of this term, from a famous London-based journalist, but rather from obviously a bit less famous feminist economists. J.K. Graham Gibson, who in 2006 published the book Post-Capitalist Politics. And somehow, just like, it kind of, these two things get mixed up here. So I usually, actually, when I think about this post-capitalist politics, I think about the feminist deconstruction of capitalist economy, rather than about this left accelerationist view of automation and grandiose bright future. So excuse me. Sorry. Well, it is even more problematic because calling any specific art world capitalist is a simplification because of the relative autonomy of the field of art. What you see here is this kind of like awful scheme by Pierre Bourdieu. It is like, says there, like CE is actually economic capital, it's cultural capital, it's basically like a C, C plus, CC minus, CCE, CC. But what is about this schedule, what it actually explains, is how claims of autonomy sits in the field of power. And not only that, but it also explains a peculiar economy of this autonomous field of cultural production, which used to cater to the high art. How to call any kind of like, and basically the Bourdieu's claim was that this is not particularly capitalist social world, but this is a social world in which capitalists feel at the best, or basically bourgeoisie. So this explains how the autonomy of art seated or was embedded in the structures of the classical capitalist bourgeois societies, with a claim for autonomy. And the claim for autonomy was that this was a topsy-turvy economy. But people worked for art. They made art for art's sake. They didn't really engage in art for commercial profit. If they did, they were located somewhere, a bit beyond this type of autonomous field of art, and it was always a bit peculiar. It was usually related, as later Adorno and Horkheimer would analyze, in cultural industries, which possibly you could say that they were capitalists in the mode of production. In this sense, that people were employed, and they were usually wage laborers, by capitalists, who in this way extracted value from the wage labor of people employed and kind of like producing mass commodities on the market. While with artists, it wasn't like this. They had an autonomy of the studio, they usually they were not employed by anybody, and yet somehow this field was usually occupied or like was working for the benefit of capitalist society at large, at least within certain limits, like providing distinction and so on and so forth. But now, when we say, or when we usually discuss the integration of certain artworks, or like market-related artworks, with the elites of financial capitalism, we usually think that something changed, so that some of these autonomous, or like claims for autonomy, which were previously sort of sustained by the museums as treasure, not as really as treasuries, or museums as temples, or like as people kind of like trying to work for the benefit, not for any personal benefit, they just committed, they invested, they sacrificed for the sake of art. Currently, this type of autonomous field got much more directly integrated in capitalist society. But I think that this is not particularly true. I mean, even now, when we are talking about the higher echelons of the global art world, or this particular art world, which you know possibly here from Frieze, or which you know from like 5 different types of openings in the Tate group, and so on and so forth. Still, usually, it rather calibrates the notions of autonomy for its own sake. So, for example, art costs so much because it is priceless. Right? Art costs so much because it is priceless. So basically, claims for value, or the economic speculation with certain types of objects, like artworks, they are still using the unique value of art in order to sustain themselves and sustain their claims for betting for higher prices on auctions and so on and so forth. It's a peculiar economy. It's not directly integrated. It is kind of integrated, but it is integrated on its own terms. Saying all this doesn't mean that everything is fine. Obviously, some art worlds dominate other, just like capital dominates labor, and values are extracted for benefit of the few. What I'm actually showing here, these 2 images, I'm not sure whether you know it, it's like these are images by an activist group called Illuminator, part of the Occupy Museums network, who were working also with Gulf Labor, it was Gulf Labor Art Coalition. It was basically, I forgot the acronym, but it was a group of artists who were analyzing the labor relations in Guggenheim, Abu Dhabi, and also kind of targeting Guggenheim in New York in order to discuss the kind of conditions of labor, which were basically slave-based labor used in Abu Dhabi to construct these grandiose buildings down there. So yeah, so some art worlds definitely are dominating. And I will not repeat all these discussions here of like a world of duty-free art with huge global turnover of objects, bodies, and different forms of capital, money, reputations, and connections. Because obviously, I mean, like what is also important to understand when we are discussing this type of art worlds in late capitalism, or kind of dominating art worlds in late capitalism, is that we do need to consider different forms of capital. So money is just part of the issue. We have connections, we have symbolic value, we have kind of reputations which are at stake and which might be siphoned, which might be unequally distributed, which are hierarchically distributed in fact, and also sometimes exploitatively siphoned from one group of people to other. But money is just part of the problem. But dominant art world does not mean the only one possible. And this is the important part of this discussion. There are many other plausible art worlds, networks of social cooperation with their own modes with their own modes of production, exchange, and value systems. So usually what happens when people start to discuss or kind of criticize the economy of art, they consider this and that as the only one actually existing modes of producing art. And this is not the case. There are many other ways how people do make art, how do they exchange art, what art means for them. And you in the world of photography, or like, I'm sorry, like using this kind of generalistic you, but like people in the world of photography also know that there are like lots of different ways how people make photographies. There are like vernacular photographies, there are like photographies which are in this huge stocks which were discussed today. There are lots of different ways how photographies do exist, how they are made, how they are exchanged, and what do they mean for people who make them, or see them, or view them, or use them. And I'm using here a slide and of a book called Plausible Art Worlds, which is an atlas, or like a kind of an attempt to recapitulate. I think it was 2 or 3 years old, 2 or 3 years long project organized by an art activist group, Basecamp in New York, who tried to create a sort of like atlas, or like maybe like oral history of different plausible art worlds, or what they called as plausible art worlds. They were interviewing people who, for example, established, like artists who established community gardens, but also hacktivist networks, or people who are engaged in urban struggles or political movements. Like plenty of different ways how people do actually make art. And in this book, which is available online, you can find a kind of snippets of these conversations, and on the web page you can actually follow the discussions that the group organized a couple of years prior. And here I come actually to the image, which is directly related or sourced from the book I already mentioned, so from a book on post-capitalist politics by J.K. Graham Gibson. It is, at least in some circles, it is a scheme which explains how capitalist economy operates. And now, after all these discussions that we had today, I realized that I made a mistake here. Because I said relation between post-capitalist art worlds and market-related art world resembles relation between post-capitalist economies and mainstream capitalist economy. And it shouldn't be resembles, it should be will resemble, maybe, if we think that post-capitalism is something that happens in the future. But it might not happen in the future, but what would it entail? And why there would be, so possibly if we talked about in the present tense and also try to describe this particular scheme, it should be something like this. Relation between plausible art worlds and market-related art world resembles relation between non-monetary economies and mainstream capitalist economy. If we talk about it in the present sense, in a simple present. So, why? Because what this image explains is how the monetary economy, which we usually focus on when we engage in a political or like kind of classical critique of political economy of capitalism, how this is only a tip of an iceberg. The whole argument is that there are like plenty of different forms of labor, of exchange, different forms of economies on which on the exploitation of which capitalism thrives. So this is a kind of like, I'm not sure whether you see it, but this image should resemble an iceberg. Like with a tip, which is small, and the bulk of the ice hidden underwater. I think what is also interesting in both, when people think about it, in terms of economy, but also in terms of, even more in terms of art, is that visibility plays a role here. So, one of the conditions of exploitation of this invisible body or bulk of labor and of exchanges is that it remains invisible. So this is a whole critique of so-called externalities. Let's say that, like possibly you all know it, but one of the main kind of the argument would go that exploitation of wage labor is not actually how capitalists make profit. I mean, it's only part of how capitalists make profit. Really, they make profit by not paying for certain things that they should pay for. So, for example, environmental damage. Or, for example, for like invisible labor of women at home. So if they pay wage to a worker, usually this relation is supported by the bulk of invisible labor of women who stays at home. Their labor remains invisible, and yet it is structurally necessary for the 5? It's just 12, it says here.
14.
Okay. But this fellow is ill, so yeah, illegal, unpaid, moonlighting, self-employment, you know, like all this and that. Anyway, like what we can say that if we think about how the art world operates, or like art worlds operate, there are also this kind of like the visibility plays an enormous role in it. Some types of labor are being neglected, or some inputs are being neglected or like obfuscated in how you imagine, or in how the excuse me, I just like lost my track. In how the valorization does unfold in the mainstream art market related economy. So, like, you know, you have all this invisible work of assistants, but also you have what Gregory Chollet called artistic dark matter. Basically, 95%, the argument would be 95% of art related worlds, or like people who populate them, are invisible. And yet they are structurally necessary to maintain the system in which some people make enormous money and harness reputations. So now I will go to a couple of practical examples to sort of illustrate this, this more general theoretical argument. And I will not tell you what Center for Plausible Economies is because it would require yet another presentation. But I will refer to the projects that we did, just in one word. Center for Plausible Economies is a mock institution, R&D department of the company Drinks, which is located in Barking. If somebody is interested in what company Drinks is, I will gladly explain it, but usually Kachin Bom, who is an artist organizing this enterprise, talks about it in about 20 minutes. Considering that I have 4, unfortunately. Next time. But this scheme is actually explaining how she produces, how she creates a sort of sustainable art-led enterprise operating from Barking by organizing a sort of drink production and different types of economic circuits. She talks about, it's more like a kind of art-led cooperative, and she talks about cultural economy. She works a lot with commons and stuff like this. What I will engage with is the case of the Association of Art Rutile, which was established a couple of years ago to facilitate the usership of art. The Association of the Art Rutile was actually established by artist Tania Bruguera, who you might know from her recent commission in Turbine Home. But I think that the association is actually much more interesting. It was established, I think, after her exhibition in Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, after 2013, and it entails now, its task is to take care of and facilitate the online archive of useful art, of this Art Rutile, which is accessible. It's about 350 examples gathered from 19th century onwards of different examples of socially engaged, but also simply useful art. So you work a lot with use value and with trying to bring this different, or facilitate this different ideas in the variety of communities. Please bear with this poor image. It is a result of the workshops that we did with the Center for Plausible Economies in June this year, when with people from the association, we tried to map the scheme, or like the alternative economies that are prompted by the association in order to facilitate this uses of this online archive. What you see here in the right down corner is how typically art market operate. These things are institutions. This is gallery exhibition nexus or art market, and this is an artist studio. Usually you do have a system of exchanges between the free agents in this triangle. So artists provide ideas, institutions provide institutional validation, kind of symbolic capital, and the gallery exhibition nexus financializes it all. What happens here is that a couple of major, I think, institutions like Van Museum in Eindhoven, Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid, like Whitworth Gallery in Manchester, and Frag in France, try to devise a scheme of how they call sort of like not ownership modes of collecting, in which this triangle would be broken and money and kind of and reputations and ideas recalibrated to facilitate constituencies as its main beneficiaries. The idea is that instead of collecting an object, which we talk about like an online archive, the institutions rather declare the kind of custodianship. So what they do, they rather kind of like make a declaration and financial backup of the public domain, in which these ideas would be situated. So like, time is up. So the institutions, couple of more minutes. So the institutions would be also, so the archive and the ideas which are collected in it would be facilitated by the use of this association of Art Rutile with different partnering organizations as ideas to be used or to be contemplated in different educational, ideas to be discussed in different educational situations, social situations, or political situations. My argument would be that this type of shift reframes museums as institutions of the common, as custodians of ideas and not as proprietors of artworks. To kind of understand maybe the last example, to understand the kind of, I think the implications of this gesture are enormous. Like one can refer to a very beautiful quote by Rashid Arim from his book Art Beyond Art from 2010, where he said, "Ideas as knowledge can never be trapped as a property of an individual or the institution. They can always salvage themselves, give themselves a new context, and move forward within the dynamic of new time and space." The problematic element of this quote is that he can say, can never be trapped. Obviously they are trapped. I mean, like that's how usually it happens, right? They need this type of intervention in order not to be trapped. So you need to actually devise different forms of organizational structures to support ideas as what he says, this not as a property of an institution, but rather as a kind of like free-moving potentials which can be implemented in social praxis by people who use them in any given moment. How this can work like, let me just talk very briefly about the case of the Invisible Movement of Solidarity, a project of Sanja Ivekovic dealing with the invisible trade unionists of the Solidarity movement, which was so like women who were working with Solidarity movement in the beginning of 80s, whose kind of legacy was totally obliterated by Polish historiography and removed from the public sphere of Poland and basically also abroad after the democratic transition of 1989. Ivekovic works with this iconic image of first poster, basically it's a first electoral poster from June to 1989, John Wayne, and kind of like, you know, just, people should go and vote. Of course, like males. Here we have like a woman silhouette, and then she gathered this histories of women and created an art piece, which is currently in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw. This here is a kind of interesting art piece, but what happened in 2016 is that this images were taken to the streets by groups of angry women who protested against the penalization of abortion, like which was planned in Poland back at this time. They started to use this image of a woman with a Solidarity logo and started also to rework it. So they basically used, reused, misused the original as if it was nobody's property, as if it was something in common, not bound by the laws of property and authorship. And in this sense, we need to remember that the critique of political economy of art worlds implies a critique of the social ontology, as the status of art and images changes in accordance with the use. What you saw there was an image from a street protest against fascism. There's, it's now really finishing. And from a documentary photograph, which it is a reenactment of a documentary photograph from 1936, which was at this moment hanged and presented in the main Polish Museum of Art in the exhibition about Polish 20s. So there was like a small image hanging somewhere, and this is there on top. These are people from Warsaw from 36. We took it, we repainted the banner, and put it back on the streets in 2018 to protest against the rising fascism. Thank you. Sorry.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Kuba. It's awesome. Right, we need to do cheers. Right, this is the bit I'm nervous about.
To join us. Here we go.
Okay. Hi, Mike.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
Good.
Thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, no worries.
What time is it there?
It's just past 8 in the morning.
So we're even more grateful in that case. It's it's really kind of you. So, well, we've met via email, never face to face. So this is nice.
Yeah.
There's a room full of people here. You can't see them. It's a good crowd, and they're all ready to hear from you.
Hey, room full of people.
Say hello, Mike. So, could we start off? Could you tell us just a bit about what StockC is and how it came into being, please?
Sorry, you just froze on me, so I didn't actually hear the question.
Could you tell us a bit about what StockC is and how it came into being, please?
Certainly. So StockC is a online stock photography and videography website. We are a co-op and have just currently slightly over 1,000 members located in 66 plus countries around the world. So we're headquartered in Victoria, British Columbia, but as I say, have members all around. Few meaningless stats in a sense, but we've got just slightly over half our staff are based in Victoria, but we've also got them remotely. A chunk of them in the US, some in Canada, some in Australia, and I think we've got 7 in Europe as well. So spread out around the world as well. It was formed, I tend to talk too much, so I'll try not to make this too long a story, but the founders of a stock photography company called IStock Photo basically did the classic sort of startup story. They started iStock, they ended up selling it to Getty Images back in 2004. And then much like many startup stories, they weren't too pleased with what the acquiring company did to their baby. And basically once they got past their non-competition agreements, they decided to, in a sense, do it right. I'm putting words in their mouth there, so that's not completely fair, but they started StockC, and the intent was, what had happened is at iStock, they got to see photographers and videographers basically get treated very, very poorly. And, their margins kept getting reduced, and they really had no choice or say in what was happening with their content or how it was being sold. So the co-op model was actually chosen specifically to make it extremely difficult for somebody, at the top of the company to just basically sell it to somebody else. So the photographers are all owners. In theory, we could sell, but if I were to, let's say I were to go and cut a deal with Getty, which of course would get me shot by my contributors, but let's say I did, over 66% would have to vote to approve of that sale, and they all own their individual photos anyway. So it makes it, we are here to serve our contributors and to do right by them. So our model is built around giving 50% royalty of every sale goes straight to the contributor. Any extended license, which, not to bore everybody, is a situation where if a print magazine, say, wanted to do an extended run or have way more copies than usual printed, then they have to pay a little bit extra. So 75% of extended licenses goes directly to contributors, and we don't reduce that cut for any reason. So if if there's some deal we do strike with somebody, it comes out of our operating margin. It doesn't come out of the royalties to the contributor. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Great. Thanks. So I think we've got really mixed crowds. For some of them, I imagine the kind of talk of percentages would immediately mean something. For others who I don't think are necessarily professionally involved with photography, they may not. So how do they fare in relation to somewhere like Getty, for example?
We're sort of on par for a number of their products. You could almost call us sort of mid-tier pricing. We're certainly not microstock. Like Shutterstock and iStock have different types of models in terms of what they sell, but we don't compete against subscription models and that sort of thing. So we're kind of in the middle in a sense. Some customers, like bloggers and whatnot, might view us as high priced, to be frank, because we don't, like some of those subscription models on some of our competitor sites really sell photos. In the end, photos are going for pennies in cases. So, I mean, our prices range from $15 up to hundreds. So it's kind of in the middle.
But in terms of the percentages that your photographers take, what sort of percentage would a Getty photographer, someone contributing to Getty, get, do you think?
I would suspect. I mean, I did work at iStock and Getty back in the day, so things may have changed, but it could be. My guess would be they're getting around 20 to 30%. Okay. It might vary depending on the deal they've cut with Getty or how popular their photos are. But and there are sites that purport to pay more than we do in the video and photographer space, but we're pretty solidly at the top of percentage given to photographers.
And can you tell us a bit about how a cooperative works in practice? So how decisions are made, how kind of enfranchised your members are, who makes decisions on a day-to-day basis, and so on.
Have you ever been in a room full of cats? No, it's actually quite an interesting dynamic, and I don't want to slag the competition too much, but really in most other non-co-op situations, your suppliers are just a cog in the machine, and ultimately you can make decisions as a company that they have to suck it up or go elsewhere. Whereas in our case, our photographers are owners. So you do need to have, like, in many ways, we are structured like any other corporation. We have a board. We have an executive team led by myself. I report to the board. But our members ultimately are owners, and they have the ability to submit resolutions to the company that get voted on by the rest of the membership. So they don't, we've structured it so that they're not voting on every single decision that ever gets made, because otherwise you bog down in bureaucracy and you can't move fast enough. And as a tech company, we've got to move relatively quickly. But we've got a resolution system I can certainly speak to, depending on the time we have, that is pretty robust. We built it online so that contributors can submit a what we call an idea for discussion. It gets thrown into our forums and gets voted on, and can kind of move through the stages that ultimately allows us or allows the members to influence the direction of the company. A great example is video. We started off as a photographer or a photo site, and I think I can't completely speak to this because I wasn't there at the time, but I don't think HQ thought we should do video yet, and the photographers voted in a resolution saying they wanted to do video, so we proceeded to do video. So it it's really awesome. It's I've never felt better about going to work because we are doing right by the photographers as best we can, and the discussions can be really healthy. Like I've sat down with some of our contributors who are really pissed off about something that's done or not done, or something that's going wrong with our tech. But what's cool is you can just talk about the issue, and there's this underlying trust that we're all in it together, and that we're trying to achieve the best for the photographers as possible. So,
great. And so I first learned of StockC through Kuba Szreder's work around platform cooperatives. And so is that a kind of a discussion that you're kind of tapping into? The organisation is kind of interested in the wider discussion around platform cooperatives, or was it kind of cooperative? The cooperative model fitted your purposes?
Sort of yes to both, I think.
Okay.
I mean, I certainly wasn't there in the beginning. The odd thing about Stocksy is we're 6 years old, and so we're one of the. I mean, I'm not so stupid as to say that we're a one and only, because in this day and age, everything has been repeated and ideas are always being rehashed. But we're one of the few, I think, platform co-ops that are so far succeeding in terms of both having a solid revenue model as well as being a platform co-op. So it fit our purposes. And again, I like to be careful of putting words in the founders' mouths, but it fit our purposes in the sense that it was a model that, these are my own words, I kind of look at it that I was thinking that the founders kind of created their own perfect poison pill to prevent a VC fund or some larger company from coming and swallowing up the company. And they did it intentionally, so that the photographers had a vehicle. Like, we kind of view it, or at least speaking personally here, like I view our platform is designed to give photographers the best opportunity to succeed as possible. Like, we obviously can't guarantee that they'll have success, because ultimately a customer has to come onto the site and buy their specific content. But we are a producer co-op, so we've banded together to create this platform called a Coop Model, where we bring customers to it. So in terms of the platform co-op space, we're very interested in. I mean, we do adhere to Principle 6 as best we can, where we can help other co-ops, and we like to talk to other folks about the model and what's out there. Are we the purest of co-ops, like in terms of the academia and exactly the layout of a perfect scenario of a co-op? Probably not. Like, we've got a board with 3 classes. We've got the contributors themselves, we've got employees, and we've got Class A's who are kind of founders and advisors, which allows us, I argue the strength of that is it allows us to bring in outside advisors. Like, we have Jason Weiner on our board, who's a well-known co-op lawyer who joined us because he brings just awesome insight into that realm. Sorry, I'm making a long-winded answer to, yes, we very much do try to support platform co-ops and just sort of be a bit of a player in the space. Now, ultimately, our focus has to be on our photographers, so we've gotta make sure we're still making money for them, but we definitely try to support other co-ops where we can.
And do you get the sense, so your kind of relative success so far, do you, in part, that's attributable to the quality of the content? Do you think that at least some of your client base buy into the idea of the cooperative? I mean, how do those two aspects work out in terms of your product, but also your ethos? Does it make you more attractive as yeah?
It's not. This is anecdotal. Like, it's not that we've done a survey or anything along those lines, but we've got a pretty crackerjack customer relations team that help a lot of our customers. Some of them, for these extended licenses and that, need a fair bit of hand-holding. But what we found is we don't use the story as a pitch. Like, we're not trying to guilt people into and stopping at us because we happen to be a co-op. It's kind of a, they won't buy from us if our content is shite, excuse my language. But it does resonate because most of our customers are actually artists, they're designers, so they've been screwed over in the marketplace as well. You know, the classic, hey, can you just design this logo for me and I'll give you lots of free press and that sort of thing. So we find that it's kind of like a solidifying of, like, they'll be using this because they love our content, and then when they find out about the co-op model, it resonates. And then the one piece we do leverage it with in terms of sales is there's a hard line we have to hold on deals.
Yeah.
Because of the fact we, like in any of our competition, you could argue this is a weakness in terms of the pure business model. For our competition, they can cut pricing down as far as they want for any customer, because they'll take it out of the photographer's margin, whereas we don't. So there are times we have actually had to tell customers, sorry, we can't, like, we're not prepared to go any lower because we can't, because we pay the contributors fairly, and that has worked. We've had customers that kind of stop and think about it, and they're like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense, and then they stay with us and they keep buying with us. So sorry, I'm making this a long-winded answer again, but so yes, we don't mercilessly flog it as a, you know, buy from us because we're really nice people. It's
but it can be helpful.
Yeah.
Okay. We've got time for if anyone has a burning question they want to ask.
How come I can't see the crowd?
Okay, I'll turn you round. Oh God, this is gonna be suicidal if I do. I'm not even gonna try it. They look lovely. Much nicer than me. If we thought about this differently, we would have let you see them. But if I turn this around, I'm going to unplug everything and the. Okay, there is
Unless you turn the table.
Oh no, Katrina's going to text you a photo. So.
Perfect.
God.
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay.
Hello. Can I ask how it formed in the first place, if you like? How did it sort of go from being a realization of Getty's getting all the good stuff, sort of, you know, they've done something terrible with our product, with what we've produced, but how did it grow from that initial sort of stage into the place where it is now, where you have, I'm just wondering about the beginning stages of how that formed.
So did you hear that? I guess it's kind of the difficulties of being a startup to a certain extent, and then how it grew.
No, how it grows specifically
how
into
it
a
grew
cooperative.
from an idea into a.
But very specifically the cooperative aspect.
Okay. Did you? So actually, about the at some level, the kind of the practicalities of building a cooperative is how does it go? How did it go from an idea to a fully realised and viable business based on a cooperative model?
Well, some of this will be me speculating a bit, because I did work at iStock Photo and Getty, and knew the founders from those days, but I wasn't part of, I had left and gone to another startup of a different type, putting ebooks in retail outlets on gift cards for a stretch while StockC was started. So some of this is hearsay in a sense, because it's me talking to the original founders. But it was difficult. They managed to talk a number of photographers into coming on board and bringing their content with them, because I do believe that they got blackballed by iStock and Getty in particular, if they switched over to StockC. I don't know particulars or details. It's just bits and pieces I've heard in the past, but it was difficult in that I think they had about 200 to 300 photographers. They weren't all coming from necessarily Getty or iStock. It's just photographers they had found. They got them to sign up, and it was hard. I've heard tales of how, and I'm being a little bit of dramatic. I'm being a bit dramatic here, but photographers were so shell shocked. Yeah, that's a bad term to use in light of. Doesn't compare to being in war, but photographers were so bitter from their experience at other stock agencies that it took a long time to build the trust of the membership. So if there's, in terms of trying to answer the question, the main difficulty probably came from just working out that dynamic of talking to the photographers and actually listening to them and making sure that their voices were heard in the direction of the company. Because just to back it up a bit to sort of an overall is it philosophical viewpoint, probably not. It's just practical. Like I speak to how there's resolutions that the members can submit to the system. In a perfect world, which of course we can never attain, but in a perfect world, you should never have a resolution come in. There should be enough dialogue and back and forth that ideas get dealt with and or dismissed accordingly. Now, of course, you're going to get resolutions because you have, especially with over 1,000 members, and we have so many that have English as a second language, so they often they craft their ideas better when they've got time to sort of put it into written word. But anyway, sorry, I've rambled a bit. I don't know if I answered the question.
No, I think you have. It's really interesting. Thank you. Any other? Okay.
Oh, I see the picture now. That's a pretty good group of people.
Yeah.
They're better looking than you.
Okay, we've got one more question here. Yeah. And then we'll let you go. And have you had breakfast yet?
No. That's okay.
Promise it's the last one. Then you can have.
No worries. I don't mind.
Thanks. I'll be quick. In the UK, we seem to have a lot of companies, and then we have charities, and the arts organisations tend to make themselves charities. Benefiting from the benevolence of the companies, and it's a kind of pretty. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but how do we break out of that and create more co-ops?
Okay, so did you hear that? So the issue was that a lot of the arts organisations, or kind of efforts to, I guess, break from one model, normally take up the role of charities. So kind of photographic arts organisations here will take on a charitable structure rather than a cooperative structure. And the question was really, how do we champion co-ops? How do we encourage co-ops?
How do you break out being charities that have to basically receive the benevolence of the company?
Yeah. How do we break out of charities that have to receive the benevolence from companies and champion a cooperative model instead?
Man, how did you sell me to this group? They think I have the answer to that.
You're like a guru on our screen. Yeah, tell us, guru.
Yeah. I'm just a humble webmonger trying to show I hate to sound mercenary about it, but I think I'm having difficulty answering because in terms of charities, that's a hard one. I certainly, at some of the conferences I've been to, I get the sense that people fall in love with the co-op model before they actually think about the business model. And that may be an unfair statement to make that it's that clear cut. But it's for a co-op to work, it has to benefit all the parties within it in some manner, and you need to understand ultimately why you're forming that co-op and who needs to benefit from it. But at the same time, doing it, don't lose sight of the fact it's got to make money. Now I have no experience in charities converting to a co-op or anything along those lines. And frankly, just to warn you, full disclosure, I'm only 2.5 years into being part of a co-op. I came from the dark side, the Death Star side of things before. So, but that's, if I could just give one bit of advice, it's really think through the business model first and then see the co-op model fits it and make sure that all the parties understand their role in that structure. Sorry, I feel like I'm failing in answering.
No, I think it's a really useful piece of advice because it's potentially to embrace it on ideological grounds and then it falls down on business grounds has really profound effects for the future of cooperatives, because if they're perceived as business failures, then the principle of the cooperative is kind of damaged as a consequence, or the allure of it. So no, I think it's a really, really useful answer.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because like at some of the conferences I've been to, there's a, how do I word this carefully? There's kind of there's a real, and keep in mind, I come from Canada, so we are, by most measures, we're viewed as fairly socialist. But at the same time, there's sort of, I've run across talks in that where the co-op model is kind of viewed as a way to kill capitalism. And the dilemma I have when I look at that is how do you, everybody needs to like feed themselves and feed their family, and everybody needs to participate in it. And so it's a tricky one where if you're coming into the co-op, I'll be really frank from my perspective. If you're doing the co-op model because you're ideologically bought into it, and that's the only reason you're doing it because it's anti-something, I don't know how successful you'll be. Because ultimately, you need to be giving a service or providing a good that benefits other people. And the cool thing about this is there's so many different types of co-ops and things that it's a real melting pot or mixing pot out there. I think we'll see different models come out. And so whatever I'm saying here, 10 years from now, there'll be radically different models that may work better. But just make sure it succeeds. Otherwise, it fails. And I've seen a lot of co-ops where they got a great idea in regards to the egalitarianism of the model. And you listen to it, it's like, oh yeah, that sounds really great. What's the business model? And there's nothing. It's like, oh man, well that's going to fail. And then it just makes the model itself look less sound to the rest of the world. And I firmly believe we've got something here where, without trying to sound too Canadian, where there's this middle ground. There's this middle ground where we can find this balance between rampant, unfettered capitalism, which I think is a disaster. If you just leave it alone, then yes, you just get so much inequity and inequality between the top and the bottom. And this is one where, just to me, it feels like it's just something better. Like why can't you have an actual capitalist model that is just inherently more fair to all the players in it? And the thing that I love about StockC is it's built into our structure. Like you can have corporations claim, there are corporations that probably are more fair to their stakeholders than even we are. I get it. But at their core, in their DNA, they're still like, if the leadership changes slightly or somebody else buys it, they can change a dime, whereas we can't. Mm-hmm. Like this is what I love about it, is that it forces us to think about the contributors first. And so anyway, sorry, I'm rambling. I'm getting into I'm venting a little bit, but no. I think there's a middle ground, and I think co-ops are a way to get there. And right. But we'll screw up if we just keep doing co-ops that don't actually work out in the real world for people. And that's ultimately there you go. Rant done.
Mike, thank you very much. You can't do so much nodding and smiling in the audience that you didn't get to see, but I think everyone gained a great deal from that. So thank you so much for giving up. You hear the clap now.
Well,
okay,
I
thanks.
appreciate you guys taking the time. I realize it's late in the day there, and you're probably all wanting to go have some drinks. So
we've got a panel discussion yet to do, so don't get them too excited.
Oh,
all right,
sorry.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Cheers. Bye.
All right, thank you.
Oh no. There, he's done me the favour. Okay.
Drinks are going to be coming out very shortly.
Okay.
The discussion is happening.
Great. So if I can ask Kuba, but also anyone else who's given a paper, who's here, to join us at the front, please. And the moderators too, if you... Have we got enough chair?
I'll be
Where's Martin? No, Martin's still... There's Martin. Great.
And maybe whilst we're having the discussion, you could all fill out your feedback forms.
Yeah.
So we can get the right metrics for this event, as Ben said. And please leave it under your chair or something like that where we can all collect them.
No,
or by
you
the
hand
door.
it next to the drinks, and we are going to read it before you've given your first glass of wine. I feel like is this that's on? Yeah? Can you hear? Yeah. So we need to talk about post-capitalism. So Kuba, I totally take the point, and I think it's a really interesting thing. Right? I tried to allude to it in the introduction that the term itself is kind of ill-defined to a certain extent, but I think it's very interesting the extent to which it very quickly got attached to this accelerationist agenda, and that's automating everything, a post-work world where we all live on universal basic income. And then, as you say, the J.K. Gibson-Graham model, which was much more about, as you say, challenging hegemony, challenging dominance, by identifying alternative modes of social relations, economic production, and so on. So what do you so maybe we could talk about the relationship between the two, right? Because J.K. Gibson-Graham very clear about the question of scale. So I guess my question to you is about scale, right? It's one thing to identify these alternatives, but is it through our attention alone that we're going to challenge dominance? Doesn't attention and dominance have a material base? How do we begin to shift the material base if we want to kind of challenge hegemony in those terms?
And I need to respond.
Yes, please.
You know what, I think that the question could be rephrased in this way. What is the relationship, or what was the relationship between cooperatives, or workers' clubs, social democracy, and socialist revolution? What was the relationship between both of them? Obviously there is this accelerationist critique of what they called folk politics, I think. But then they end up dreaming about some sort of new Mont Pellegrin society, but who is about to pay for it? I mean, why should be somebody paying, some kind of a rich patron paying for a socialist revolution, like it was with the neoliberal think tanks, and where I'm heading is that all these cooperatives and all this type of more equally structured institutions, organizations, clubs where people do cooperate provide a material basis for any type of new social project. That's why people actually can meet, discuss alternatives, stay in touch with, the person from Stocksy talked about trust. You will not work for any type of risky project if you do not trust other people with whom you operate. People need to know each other as well. And when I was working in my PhD about this political economy of artistic circulation, one of the most cruel elements of this is exclusion. People who are excluded from this circulation, they lose touch with each other. Not only with the modes of, with the economic platforms, or the platforms that provide visibility for some sort of abstract others, they simply lose touch with other people because with who might think, in a similar, the paradox is that people who feel about it critically, who already burst this kind of bubble of aspiration, are the ones who are usually already at the verge of being excluded from this type of circulation, And when they are excluded, they are losing touch with others who might feel similarly. And this type of cooperatives are the modes where people are still getting in touch and still in communication and still possibly trying to work on some sort of alternative project. That would be my one of many possible responses to this rather complex question.
And in terms of the model you showed, where Rena Sophia and others were breaking from the gallery market nexus, right? I mean, one way of thinking, I mean, that is, in a quiet way, redistributive, right? They're publicly funded organisations, but they're taking those public funds, and rather than use them to cement a neoliberal model and kind of play a game of corporate sponsorship, actually there's a degree to which a collective wealth generated through taxation is being redeployed to kind of prime some other economy, right?
Yeah, you have it. Exactly. I mean, like, and I think that this is important to think about this, like, instead of thinking about, like, in a sort of very general terms about capitalism and about anti-capitalism or post-capitalism, it might make sense to actually take a look at the very base, like at the quiet, this nitty-gritty reality of how the things happen. You know, how the connections, which are now fundamental for the operation of this gallery exhibition nexus, or what we know, this kind of like global art world of art fairs and so on. How did they emerge? What was necessary to happen for them to actually establish this type of hegemony? How these relationships are, like, often very personal relations as well, you know, between people, and how the institutions operate. It's not that they are not. That's the whole thing also about one of the main lies of. Sorry, I'm a bit rambling, like here, like, but one of the main lies of the neoliberal propaganda is that it does not need state. It actually state is fundamental for these operations, or some sort of publicly oriented entities. You know, there might be foundations in the states which are anyway benefited from tax breaks. There might be, like, here, public institutions, and they are substantial for actually still anchoring valorizations in the market. They might be less substantial now than they used to be, and yet they still play a role. Like, if you think about it, you know, like role of large biennales.
And so the fact that the Whitworth is an NGO, I think, MPO rather, it's not an NGO. It's it should be really weird. It's a national portfolio organisation. But the point that you've made raises some serious questions about the point that I was making, because it suggests that organisations do have a degree of agency and autonomy, and the directives being passed down from the Arts Council, maybe there's a degree of freedom to manoeuvre, in that you don't have to, it doesn't have to be a kind of wholesale reproduction of a particular neoliberal art model.
Well, obviously, if you go against a current, it's always much more difficult than if you go with it. You know, so it's what I said is not a kind of overtly optimistic vision, but you simply can't do it. You know, if you, like, even thinking about what I experienced when I experienced the discussions about this not ownership models, are people from the collection departments asking, how will we explain it even to our councillors? Because, like, how will we explain the expenditure of public funds on something which will be accessible to everyone? And not only that, it will entail further expenditure of taxpayers' money, you know? And obviously this is already, like, this argument's already embedded in a certain type of hegemonic discursive setup, in which, like, doing something what seems to be quite reasonable, so for example, public institution works for the benefit of the general public, needs to be explained as something which is much less beneficial for general public than like buying an extremely overpriced art piece in frieze.
I think this speaks
I mean, like, you know, but this is where it gets into.
And here, everything we were hearing from Stocksy, and one of the things that we haven't addressed in terms of institutions, but I think applies to all of the organisations we've been speaking about, is governance, right? And who governs, who makes decisions. And in the case of museums, it's boards of directors to a certain extent, right? And so the in terms of who is in place to reproduce a certain mode of thinking. And it's no wonder when you look at the boards of directors. I mean, this place is fairly enlightened by comparison to V&A and Tate, where you look, and it's the 1% who are sitting around those tables. And so, but even then, that's not to say that they wouldn't be open, because they're still on the board of an art museum. So, but a question for both of you. So you didn't seem to be so down on the idea of post-capitalism. I mean, you at least used the term in your paper, but Martin, you were one of the people who expressed their concerns with it as a term. What do you two see as the drawbacks, the issues, but I guess also the possibilities with this term post-capitalism and potentially its relationship to photography?
Well, I would say that throughout a lot of the talks and also the Skype call-in from Stocksy, what resonated a lot with me was these concerns about where agency lies within these institutional structures, how horizontal or democratic or kind of hierarchical tier-based they end up being. And that's, I think, something that came out as a concern from everyone, right? And that at the end of the day, unless you manage to build structures that invite participants to share in the discourse and the responsibilities of decision making, you are probably more likely to perpetuate or reproduce structures that you don't really agree with. And I mean, that's really my main criticism of the way blockchain technologies are oftentimes deployed, that there's this rhetoric of, oh, we're removing power from previously hierarchically structured kind of top-down power relations and distributing them more horizontally. And that might be true technically, but it's not true practically, and it never really is experienced that way by community members for the most part. And so very often in platform cooperativism debates, distributed semi-autonomous kind of algorithmic systems are called upon for organizing these groups. But my concern would often be then, how do participants or community members actually, how are they really involved then if you have these kind of semi-autonomous algorithmic entities enforcing rules that maybe everybody agreed upon at one point, but then becomes more and more detached from how they're enacted in a way. Yeah.
Thank you. Ryan, do you want to speak to the idea of
I guess I didn't really bring it up in my talk at all. I think because I'm still, and I certainly am critical of the left accelerationist idea of post-capitalism. And I think a lot of it, actually, interestingly, is to do with this folk politics that they really dislike. Because in a way that's my access to the political, has been through self-organizing in various ways with various people. And then I guess the things I'm interested in and things I'm reading, one of the things that came up for me in your talk actually was Eva Majewska, do you know her?
Yeah, sure.
This idea of weak resistance. So these ideas of weak resistance, and I was also thinking of Fred Moten's stealing away. As a slave you steal away because you're also stealing yourself as property. So these other forms of kind of the bottom of the iceberg organizing just seem really critical, and I can't really live with a model of capitalism, post-capitalism, where those don't exist.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess I should play devil's advocate for the accelerationist model, because otherwise we're not going to kind of rehearse its possibilities, even if we're not going to subscribe to those possibilities. So it's not that folk politics has no place to play. It's that folk politics is this way. And this isn't way away from J.K. Graham Gibson. Is it Gibson Graham? Graham Gibson?
I think Gibson Graham.
Gibson Graham. These are the spaces within which new subjectivities are developed, right? But the question is, how do we then scale those subjectivities to change structures in a larger sense? Otherwise, there's the risk is a kind of exclusivity to folk politics as well, right? It takes a particular kind of cultural capital to even be part of that. So, and the other point, I mean, we haven't spoken. Can
I still just,
please, thanks.
To what was said about governance, I think there's a very interesting thing about this Stocksy model, is that the kind of cooperative governance is not presented as aim in itself. It is presented as means to prevent hostile takeover of this type of model. Yeah. Right? So that basically it is a strategic decision making which is important and not the daily business of operating this cooperative. And I think it is like really this shift is extremely important here. Right? That there is a basic level of trust that people who are executives do operate in the name of this for the benefit of people who are incorporated. So there is no need, which is actually quite often in this sort of self-organized collectives, to check every decision, every time when it is made. But the involvement or participation of this people who are creating this corporation or like this cooperative in decision making prevents it from being sold, dismantled for the benefit of its own management, which happens so often, right? This is what is usually happening with startups and so on and so forth, right? So that's what he called about designing this poisonous pill for themselves, which I think is a super interesting way of devising it, right? Which is also possibly presenting this whole debate about self-governance and the kind of strategy versus tactics and so on and so forth in a bit different light, in a bit different direction. So there's not about, for example, like Eva Majewska also, or like different people now really seriously rethink party model, right? So it is about how to make the party leadership accountable to their own membership, right? Or like to people whose interests they do represent. Right, because they also respond to the failure, the general systemic failure of Occupy movements, like in a sense of like that, like everybody needs to take sort of like a position, at least in response to what happened. So I think that these are like interesting also like learning curves, of people who are trying to rephrase these questions in a bit different type of environment, but not necessarily, it's not an either or type of thing.
I think that's still going on, that learning process.
Oh, definitely.
Right? Where just as you said, with the Occupy movement, it got kind of mired in the very simple practicalities of how can everybody hear what any one person is saying and so forth. Like in the cooperative context now, I feel like a lot of projects get really slowed down and bogged down by the technicalities of how to structure themselves. The Stocksy CEO was kind of talking about, what was he saying? Like, you need to have a business model first and then really think about how to implement a meaningful structure for that. Well, in the broader context, if you want to really talk about post-capitalism, then maybe I want to rephrase that, because business model doesn't sound very post-capitalist. Maybe really we need to be asking, what political model or political system do we aim to facilitate or make possible? And then you can think about the structure that you want to put in place to make that possible. If the aim is something that still operates along the lines of a business model that can function in competition with capitalist corporations alongside which it wants to exist, then to me personally that kind of disqualifies it as being part of anything that's post-capitalist in that sense. Which that doesn't mean it's not a great project, but it's maybe categorically or qualitatively different from what many of us might be thinking about when they're thinking about post-capitalism.
Are there any questions? I'm conscious that we've done.
Yeah,
Can you wait for the mic?
Thanks. Just on that last point that you made, I wonder, I kind of disagree with what you just said, in that I think just because said cooperative is in competition with other extremely capitalist organizations doesn't mean that they can't be that first stone that triggers a wave. And I think, while listening to you guys, I kept thinking what happened, or what would happen if we had cooperatively organized alternatives to the big five of Facebook, Google, Amazon, and so on. And how long would that take to create such a wave? How big does the stone need to be? How much energy would we have to come up with? And I think it's it might make sense to think as far and big as that, because as that CEO just mentioned, it took them 6 years to get 1,000 people to trust them, but it took Facebook, 15 years to con millions of people. So trust is clearly more difficult, but should appeal to most of us. So I'm curious whether we need to think less in alternatives and more in taking them on their own game.
And I mean, doing that would mean to kind of deturn or appropriate mechanisms and structures, I guess, and work with them, right?
No, I don't.
Or use them, or whatever.
I mean, when you say work with them, being the mechanisms, or
the mechanisms, yeah.
Yes, I mean, obviously I have not thought this through. Let's just take down Facebook. No, that's not that was not my point to go into the nitty-gritty of that right now, right here.
Okay.
But my question is more whether that is a thought that we want to elaborate on or investigate, or whether that is interesting to others.
I mean, there have been efforts, right, and one of the challenges network effects, right, is that which the kind of monopoly tendency is built into the platform model, and so that's one of the problems, is that users beget advertisers, beget efficiency, beget more users. But yeah, I take the point. Should we, one more question then drinks?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Question.
Wait, there's one more question at there. No, we can keep the conversation going over drinks if you feel that you're...
Can I ask very quickly, just there was mention a minute ago of strategy versus tactics. Could you very specifically address what you mean by that, please?
Yeah, I mean, like in this, I really meant this particular example of this Stocksy. How a certain type of daily decision making is being resolved on a kind of, I assume at least, because it wasn't so spoken about in detail, but it doesn't engage, every decision doesn't engage all the members to be taken. So you have sort of executive decisions possibly being taken by executives, but then they are accountable to the whole membership, and this elements of direct democracy are implemented in order to prevent a strategic dismantling or takeover of this cooperative. So that but obviously I mean it in this particular sense, so not necessarily in this more broad discussion about tactics and strategies. Though then it's also would relate to this first question of what is a relationship between all these cooperatives, of this kind of more equally organized institutional ecosystems and general systemic change. And I think there is a relation, and there's a positive feedback loop between the both.
Great. Thanks, you three. Thanks, Kuba, for your excellent paper. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Thanks, Katrina, for curating an amazing exhibition and doing this together. And thanks, Joseph.
I invite
and
everyone
Sam.
back for part of the show, which is happening here in late January, where we'll be turning the gallery into a troll farm tasked with reversing Brexit. So this whole floor will be transformed into an office where you two can learn, get fake followers, and weaponize them against, and change the world. So please come back, but please join us for a drink now.